Warning: tube amplifiers have lethal voltages inside them. Please do not attempt to build, test, or repair these without understanding and following all safety protocols. Hey y'all! Well, we got this thing finished. And first thing I did was hooked it up to my system and listened to it for a couple hours and then just let it play for a couple more hours and just kind of let things get settled in. And just like I thought, for the first 30 minutes or so, it sounded kind of brittle and harsh, and that's what these Mundorf caps do. But after about 30 minutes or halfway through a CD, it started kind of loosening up, and after the first CD went through it, it really started sounding good. But I noticed it sounded a little, say, muffled, or the it's like the treble, if you had a bass and treble knob, it was like the treble knob was turned down a little bit. And it just didn't have that little sparkle that I'm expecting to hear out of this. And that was just with, the Gold Line 12AX7 and these JJ EL34 tubes. Hadn't done any tube rolling. And wanted to kind of initially voice the amp with those tubes. And so I tried some different shade feedback resistors, went to a 470K, and like the Three Little Bears, that was a little too much. Went down to a 360K, and that sounded pretty good. I mean, that started really sounding nice. And then I tried like a 420K, and that was again a little, now I'm getting there like, we're getting very close here on each side of it. And so I went back to the 360K and just kind of left it there. I did notice too when it had the 300K in it, I was noticing I had to turn it up to like 5/8 on the volume knob, which was a little hotter than I would with my 6SQ7 with the same kind of feedback and stuff. But when I put the 360 and the higher in it, then at half volume it was good. So, which is what my 6SQ7's like. So, felt like, okay, maybe it's these 5K output transformers is the difference. I don't know. We've changed a little bit of stuff. And so I could see that impacting the amount of shade feedback that's needed. So anyway, got a point where, okay, this thing's sounding pretty good. It's not really voiced yet, but this is like getting reasonable. And so now we're going to do a bunch of testing. And I want to first go the 6SQ7 EL34 amp, show you a review of what that tested like, because this is kind of what we're trying to get this to sound like, is that amp. I mean, that's got over a year of tuning and voicing on it, so it's going to take a little work to get to that point. But I'm going to compare it to this, and then we're probably going to roll a couple of front end tubes, and it's going to be kind of a long video, so let's get busy testing. Okay, so first we're going to put the OG 6SQ7 EL34 amp on the Analog Discovery 2, and this amp to me has always been a really sweet sounding amp, and it's what made me decide to use the 12AX7 EL34 as the initial product we're going to make. It's not the lowest distortion amp on the planet. That is not its goal. Like some of these other really good sounding tube amps, in the listening range, you're going to have 2, 3, possibly even 4% distortion in the range that's making power. And you can see down here, under a watt, it's under 1% distortion, but then you get up here at 3 watts, and there's 2% distortion, and it keeps climbing up. Right about in here, you see the line angle up more sharply. And I think this is probably about where the amp starts clipping. As you can see, the line's pretty straight until it gets to this point. So let's flip over to our scope here and put in some voltages. And you can see right here where I was talking about at a little over 5 watts, it's 0.7 volts RMS. So go over here, here's 0.7 volts RMS. Run this again just so you can see this is legit. Nice clean sine wave. Let's go up to 0.8. Make a big enough jump where we can actually see if it's clipping big time. You can see right here, it's clipping away on the top. So let's try 0.75, and it's pretty rounded clipping. If you ran into this, probably wouldn't sound horrible, but I kind of have to draw the line. I always say that when the amp starts clipping, that's when the power stops. Let's see what 0.75 does. Still a little bit right there. I mean, it's pretty good, but you'll see when we go back to 0.70, it cleans up. So I think 0.70 is kind of our max input level before we start clipping. So here's 0.6, and looks pretty much the same. I mean, it is a little distorted, but it's not clipping. So come back here to our THD versus power. Again, 0.7 volts in and 5.3 watts is where the amp starts showing some signs of clipping. So here's the real issue I was trying to solve with this amp, and that's the THD versus frequency. You can see down here at 1K, it's got 1.5%, but even down at 100 hertz, it starts climbing up. You get down to 60 hertz, you're at 3.5%. This is at 2 watts of power. And then down here at 20 hertz, we've got almost 25% distortion. And yeah, most speakers aren't going to work down here, but that's still not ideal. And here at 40 hertz, where most speakers will pull down to, you've got almost 6% distortion. And then the real issue is, look at the lower left screen at the spectrum. It's not just around the fundamental frequency, which is the one on the left. It like radiates out multiple points out. And you can see when you get up into this frequency here, it's only like the first two you see spiking up. So let's look at the second order harmonic distortion. You can see that the majority of the THD is second order. And then third order jumps way down, which is what we want to see. And that's why I don't mind seeing a little bit of distortion out of the amp. It's mostly second order harmonics. So I'm hoping on the new amp, this is going to be lower, and there'll be a bigger jump between the second and third order harmonics. I don't mind seeing even just, if this was even a little higher, if this jumps down lower. So the last thing we're going to check is the frequency response. We come up to this chart here. We see at 1 watt of power, we're basically 0.3 volts RMS in. So we pulled the frequency response at 0.3 volts RMS, and this is a really nice looking frequency response. There's a little weird drop off here at 20 hertz, which is about 1 dB down from what it is at 30 hertz, but not real concerned about that. But again, most speakers start working right around in here. I mean, it would be nice if this was smoother in here. Let's see what the other amp does in that range. But here on the top end, at 15K, we're down 0.3 dBs, and at 20K, we're down 0.5 dB. That's, for all intent and purposes, a flat frequency response. So anyway, I wanted to show you what this amp does, and one of the reasons that we're not building this as a production amp is trying to source the input tubes is almost impossible. I mean, you can find them, but the only place you're going to get them is on eBay because they're 60-year-old tubes, and from experimenting with them, a lot of them are really bad sounding. Like all those metal tubes, they just don't sound good, and they've got a ton of distortion. And this curve you're seeing here is after a year of tweaking on this amp, trying different feedback resistors, playing with different front end tubes as far as brands, trying to find some low distortion ones. And I found these old metal-based National Unions, which are almost impossible to find, have the lowest distortion. And so I can't build a production amp based off of a design that's using eBay-only tubes and lucky to find the good ones, one or two of them a month, if that. That's just not a viable deal. So that's why we switched over to this 12AX7, and let's hook it up and see what the initial measurements are on it. Okay, so here's our first pull on the 12AX7 EL34 amp, and this is with the 5K output transformers, and like I explained at the start of the video, we've got about 20% less negative feedback to get it to really sound good. And so I'm looking at this screen, and we've got a little more distortion here at 1 watt. We got about a 0.5% more, and it kind of continues that 0.5% more distortion up the range. And the difference here that I'm seeing is at this 5.3 watt level, I'm not seeing the distortion turn up. And it's not till probably at this point up in here that the distortion turns up. And again, here at 0.7 volts RMS in on this amp, we're making a little over 7 watts, which is almost 2 watts more than the 6SQ7 amp made, albeit with a little more distortion. If we go here on the scope, once again at 0.7 volts RMS, there's no clipping. When we go to 0.8, got the same clipping. And then at 0.75, it's pretty clean, but I think you'll see a little bit of a bump here when we go down to 0.70. This is rounding off a touch as it goes past 0.70, which again on this screen, 0.70 is 7.3 watts at just over 5% distortion, which clearly this is not where you want to be running the amp, more in this range here. If you're listening between this 1 and 3 watt range and have this for headroom, you could probably stand even up to 4 watts. But in this range, it's going to sound good. And I'll show you why here on this screen. So here's our THD versus frequency. And you remember with the other amp and transformers down here at 20 hertz, we had 25% distortion. Now we've got 10. And if we scroll up here to 40 hertz, where most speakers start kicking in, we've got 3.5% distortion. Again, this is at the same 2 watt power level. And then you can see it just flattens out from there. So we got rid of this giant hump. And you can see here on this spectrum analyzer on the lower left, down at 20 hertz, we do have harmonics out several points along the frequency curve. But once we get down here to 40 hertz, it's the first two. So let's look at the second order harmonics. You can see it's almost identical to the total harmonics. So all this harmonic distortion that we're seeing here, it's all even order harmonics, which is the good sounding kind. And then this is the nasty sounding third order. And look at the huge jump between the second order, third order harmonics. That's why this amp sounds good. Even though it's got some harmonic distortion, it's all the good kind, which is kind of what we were designing this amp to be. If I was wanting to make a super clean, super low distortion tube amp, we'd be using like global negative feedback and some other things. But we are looking to create some good harmonic distortion so it sounds like a tube amp. I mean, why have a tube amp if it's going to sound like a solid state amp? So finally, let's look at the frequency response. Again, let's see where we're at 0.24 volts RMS at 1 watt. So let's do this at 0.24. So we're doing the frequency response at the same power level, which would be 1 watt. And let's see what this looks like. And as you can see on this amp, we got rid of that weird bump here around 20 hertz, or in this low range. And this is about as flat a frequency response as you're going to see. If you look at the upper right hand corner, those red numbers, that first one showing it's basically 0 dB across this whole range. You pick up 1/10 of a dB down here below 40 hertz. And then on the top end at 15K, it's down 1/2 dB, and just shy of 1 dB at 20 hertz, which I can totally live with that. So guys, this looks really good to me for a fresh build. That the tuning so far was done by ear. I know what sounds good, and so we're not going to be changing things too much. I do want to try some different driver tubes and possibly some different output tubes, but I'm pretty sure these JJ EL34Ls aren't going to be, any kind of big change. I could see the driver tubes impacting some of the stuff, especially this curve here. I mean, if I can't get this to come down a little bit, I'm not going to add negative feedback and make the amp sound muffled to try to get the measured THD lower. Not going to do that. But if changing the driver tube and stuff helps and we don't have to negatively impact the sound signature of the amp, hey, that would just be some gravy, right? Okay, so let's do a little bit of quick tube rolling. I've got a 7025 Electro-Harmonix new production tube that I dropped in, and it's a lower noise, a little cleaner tube. I use them in my EL34 clone preamps, and they always sound good. So I haven't actually listened to the amp with this tube rolled in it. I'm just doing some quick testing, and it definitely lowered the distortion about, looks like about 0.75% across the whole range. So we're down here at the same level we were at with the 6SQ7 amp of 1 watt at 1%. We've got 3 watts at under 2%, and I'm not seeing like the line or the slope here turning up until it goes past 7 watts. So let's see what we're getting here at this 0.8 volts RMS range on the scope, and see if that's still clean power. So here's 0.8 volts RMS, and yeah, I'm not seeing clipping. Let's go on up to 0.85, and obviously this is going to take more input signal to drive the amp with this tube, and then I'm just barely seeing a little shift here in the top of this curve. Let's see if it's clipping at 0.9. Definitely clipping at 0.9. So if we were generous and said 0.85 is not clipping, if we look at this screen here at 0.85, we're making a little over 7 watts. So it starts you could say it starts getting distorted in this range here, but that's 4% distortion at 7 watts. So just changing the driver tube had a big impact on the distortion, which is what I think we're going to find, and it's why I've ordered a whole bunch of different JJ and some gold pin Electro-Harmonix tubes and stuff to try in this amp and figure out which tubes really do sound best in it. I mean, I would have hoped that Gold Lion tube did. It sounded really good in that Musishare X7, but probably biased a lot lower. Maybe when it gets biased hotter, it doesn't sound as good. So again, back down here at our frequency versus THD, we're not seeing any difference down here at 20 hertz, which I think is a function of the output transformer. And again, we've got 2 different output transformers we're going to be demoing in this amp to figure out which one of those work the best before we go into production with this thing. But down here at 40 hertz, we're at 3%, which is similar, but it drops off much lower. At 100 hertz, it's below 2%. Again, this is pulling at 2 watts, and then it flattens out across this whole range. And again, second order harmonics are almost identical to the total, and the third drops way down here. So it's going to be interesting to hear what this tube sounds like. So here are the results of this 5751JJ new production tube, and got to go listen to this, but the distortion on this looks the best of anything we've plugged in this amp so far. You can see down here it's close to a 0.5% distortion at a watt, goes past 1% at 2 watts. At 4 watts, we're still under 2%. Doesn't go past 2% till 4.5 watts. And I think it's going to be good for 7+ watts on the top end before it starts clipping. So here at 0.75 volts RMS, we've got almost 8 watts. And that's under 4% distortion. Let's see what, here's 0.7 volts. That's clean. 0.75. Yeah, it's just a little bit of funkiness here at the very top. Pretty sure at 0.8 volts we're going to start seeing the heavy clipping we were seeing before. Yeah, that's definitely clipping. I can honestly say at this 0.7 volts RMS, there's no clipping whatsoever. So if we come back to this THD versus power, and we come up to 0.7 volts, yeah, just past 7 watts of output power. Guys, who knows? This may be the tube we end up using in this thing. Again, I've got to go listen to all these tubes too. And I've got about 6 other 12AX7 type new production tubes coming that we're going to listen to and measure. But I wouldn't have a problem speccing this amp with EL34 L output tubes with 5751 driver tubes. And these are new production. You can go buy these today off the shelf. So let's look at the THD versus frequency again. And again, down here at 20 hertz, we've got the same 10% distortion. I'm convinced that's the output transformer. But once you go past 100 hertz, it starts flattening out, and it's down here at 1% across the whole frequency range. And when we do the second order harmonics, again, it's almost identical to the total harmonic distortion. And when we go to the odd order harmonics, it drops down here to less than 0.5%. And again, could be an option where, hey, I want a little cleaner sounding amp and I need a little more power. I've got some lower efficiency speakers where the power is going to be centered around this 3 watt point. You might want to run these 5751 tubes and get lower distortion, you know, the 1 to 2% distortion in this range, where if you're running some super high efficiency speakers that are centered around 1 watt and you're using this range in here, then you might want to use a little higher distortion tube to get that nice second order harmonic distortion sound that we listen to tube amps for. So looks like we're going to have a lot of options on tubes to run. And again, I need to sit down and listen to all these tubes and possibly change the negative feedback that's being used for different tubes to get the distribution of frequencies that sound good to me. So yeah, I'm already excited, and this is just with the first pair of transformers. We've got 2 more of these amps to build and play with and listen to before we decide on what the final production one's going to be. I know some people are, you know, hey, I want to buy the amp yesterday. I am not going to put these up for sale until they sound the best that I think I can make them sound, with the tubes that I know sound good, with them wired with the right transformers and all that stuff. So anyway, this looks like a place to wrap up this video. Well, those were some interesting results, and it's interesting to me how much the distortion changed with the different input tubes. And so, we've got some of these that I tried. I did roll a new old stock GE 12AX7 in just to kind of see what that did. And again, I haven't listened to any of these tubes. I think I did listen to 7025 and it sounded pretty good. But anyway, we're just at the beginning stages of voicing this amp. And so what tubes we end up with, I have no idea. I've got all these output tubes I want to try. Well, we're probably not going to, seriously consider these KT66s because these are NLA, but the rest of these are still in production. Some 6CA7s, some KT77s. We got a whole bunch of other stuff, and there may be some things like we put some more shade feedback resistance in it, which turns down the treble a little bit, but then we put a little bit brighter tubes like these Gold Lion KT77s and might bring it right back. And then we get the distortion down and get the same sound signature. I mean, there's a lot of balancing left to do on this amp to figure out what is ideal, and that's part of what the value is going to be in this amp. Is I'm going to spend a lot of time voicing it with very specific tubes and types to get the sound that I want to see out of this thing. And also, I'm hoping to get 6-7 watts of power out of this thing. 7 would be nice, as the clipping point power. And I'd like to keep the distortion under, 3% at max power and be able to get like 5 watts at 2%, something like that. I'd be happy with all of that. So we still got a little bit of tuning to do. We still got 2 different pairs of output transformers to try on the amp. So I got 2 more amps to build, and then I want to do some A/B back-to-back listening tests with the different amps, with the same tubes and with different tubes, and figure out which combination is the real secret sauce to making something special. And we're not going to put this thing up for sale until I figure out what that secret sauce is. And I'll be sharing it all with you on the channel because, hey, that's what we do here at Skunky Designs. I'm also going to go into more detail about this in the Monday monologue, so make sure you catch that. So I hope you're enjoying this series. If you are, please subscribe to the channel. Please like the video. Thanks to all you Patreon supporters and also you folks that give your generous donations. I really appreciate that. It helps me go out and buy these piles of tubes that I need to do this voicing. Until the next video, have a great day.